Hello. Earlier this week, the IPCC released a new report. If you don't know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, is a group of the world's top climate scientists assembled by the United Nations and tasked with writing reports on climate change. This is the third and final part of the IPCC's sixth assessment report. The first report came out in August in the lead up to COP26, and it focused on the scientific aspects of climate change and what will happen as climate change progresses. The second report, which came out a month ago, was about the impacts of climate change, the ways in which we must adapt to the climate effects that are already happening and those that are inevitable at this point, and the need to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. The last report, which came out earlier this week, is about mitigation, or actually stopping climate change. In short, it says that we must stop burning fossil fuels to stop climate change. The report basically compiles all of the evidence and shows what targets we need to hit to reach net zero emissions. I will explain all of this in greater detail in a minute, but first, some background info. Climate change isn't something that either happens or it doesn't. We already are feeling some of the effects of climate change, and with every fraction of a degree of warming, it will get worse. Global temperatures have already risen around 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial times. While past agreements like the Paris Climate Agreement have set the limit at 2 degrees of warming, we must limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius because it would enormously limit the effects of climate change. And the good news is, this is possible. The new report clearly states that we can limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. For reference, current climate policies would bring us to around 3 degrees of warming, which would be ruinous. Now, onto the report. Firstly, the new report explains that we can cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2050 and reduce them by 70% by 2050. The report also states that limiting warming to around 1.5 degrees Celsius requires global greenhouse gas emissions to peak before 2025 at the latest and be reduced by 43% by 2030, again, at the very latest. At the same time, methane emissions also need to be reduced by about a third. Even if we do this, it is almost inevitable that we will temporarily exceed this temperature limit, but we could return below it by the end of the century. But we can prevent even this from happening. As I previously stated, we can reduce emissions by more than 43% by 2030. 43% is just what we have to do. Again, the global temperature will stabilize when carbon dioxide emissions reach net zero. For 1.5 degrees Celsius, this means achieving net zero carbon dioxide emissions globally in the early 2050s. We can do this. We just cannot invest in any more fossil fuel infrastructure, and we must divest from fossil fuels in all sectors of the economy. It is important to note that we have seen some good signs of progress. While most fossil fuel emissions continue to increase, we have seen sustained drops in the growth rate of greenhouse gas emissions over the last decade. Basically, we're still burning more fossil fuels every year, but the amount that is increasing by is decreasing. We have also learned that you do not need to increase emissions to grow economically. In the past decade, many nations have shown sustained growth and reduced their emissions, proving that we do not need to rely on fossil fuels. But simply reducing some emissions will not be enough. We need to reach net zero emissions as fast as possible. The report outlines that we need immediate and deep emissions reductions across all sectors to reach carbon neutrality. While greenhouse gas emissions can and must peak before 2025, as stated earlier, this will be very challenging. Every area of our global economy needs to transition to green energy and use that energy more efficiently if we are going to halt climate change. This also needs to happen now. By now, I don't mean this year or this decade. I mean today. If we are going to stop climate change, we need to act now. Luckily, clean energy has shown great signs of improvement. The report explains that since 2010, there have been sustained decreases of up to 85% in the costs of solar and wind energy and batteries. Clean energy is getting much cheaper and much more efficient, meaning that it can now compete with fossil fuels on price. Batteries have also gotten much cheaper in the last few decades, which is necessary because many green energies like wind and solar don't work all the time because it's not always windy or sunny. So it is necessary to have batteries to meet energy demand. That being said, we cannot solely rely on technology to save the day. We must also consume less if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, since tech takes time to improve. We have seen a lot of fake action on the climate crisis. While there have been some successes, there have been far too many empty promises and failed negotiations. There is no time for that anymore. We must take action while we still can, and we need to work a lot harder than we have been to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. We must also focus on climate justice and making sure everyone is helped equitably. Sustainable development requires equitable treatment to succeed. In summary, it's now or never. We need to reach net zero as quickly as possible. We need to fight as hard as we can for our planet and our future if we are going to succeed.